Good morning, everyone. I am glad to welcome you today to this webinar organized by EuroACE, the European Alliance of Companies for Energy Efficiency in Buildings. I am Hélène Sibilo, and I work at EuroACE as a Senior EU Affairs Manager, but today I will guide you through this webinar as a moderator. Just a short announcement on housekeeping rules, although I'm pretty sure we're all getting used to those since last week, but I will still spell them out. As a participant, you are kindly asked to remain muted for the whole duration of the webinar. We also ask you to not turn on your camera so that we don't overload the web and so that we don't consume that much energy. Only the speakers and myself will stay unmuted. After the speaker's presentation of about 10 to 12 minutes, a Q&A session of around 20 to 25 minutes will take place. During this Q&A session, but also already during the presentation, you can type in your questions in the GoToMeeting chat box. Please address your question to everyone in this chat box, as we like it to be a transparent process. During the Q&A session, I will pick the questions and read them out loud to Adrian Joyce. If time does not allow to cover all questions, then they will be forwarded to the speaker for a later response in writing. And yes, the PowerPoint presentation, the recording of the webinar, and the questions will be shared with you in due course. Now I pass on the floor to Julie Kestrup, our president, for the formal introduction to this webinar.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you hear me okay. So first of all, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Julie Kestrup and I'm in charge of Group Public Affairs at Danfoss, and I'm also the president at EuroACE. So we're very excited to welcome you online, and we hope you're comfortable and that you've helped yourself to a coffee and maybe a croissant. But if not, don't despair. This is a 45-minute session and we kept it that short on purpose so that we can all hopefully stay alert and tuned in throughout. Now, we have a really diverse audience with us today. We've got people from the EuroACE membership, we've got partners, we've got representatives from the Parliament, from the Commission, from Perm Reps. So we're really looking forward to a good discussion on the renovation wave. And as Hélène says, even though we're now online and we're a little bit more restricted in terms of how to discuss, we really want your input here. So please do feel free to pass on your comments, your questions throughout on the chat box. I also want to say that this is the first session out of 3 that we're organizing. They're all going to be in the same format, and the next 2 are going to place next week. And I'll get back to you at the end of the session on what those 2 will be on. Now, I don't think there's any beating around the bush. The world as we know it is not standing right now. And the fact that we're all live from studies and living rooms and kitchens from all over Europe this morning is a testament to that. But the European Green Deal remains a key policy priority. And the Renovation Wave Initiative an important 2020 milestone, at least from our end. I think we've all, over the past week, seen articles and op-eds pulling in both directions. There are those saying that we can't afford to put so much emphasis on an ambitious climate and energy policy, now that we need to spend our efforts and our money restarting Europe's economies. And then there are those on the other side arguing that, on the contrary, now is exactly the time to do so. And I don't think I need to explain to you which side of the argument we're on as EuroACE, but suffice to say that our key arguments, namely that buildings must necessarily be tackled if we are to become climate neutral in Europe by 2050, and that our sector holds a lot of potential for jobs and growth, still hold true. And I also just wanted to remind ourselves that not more than a month ago, actually only about 3 weeks ago, we actually set out, or the European Commission set out with the climate law, our intention as Europe to do exactly that, to be climate neutral by 2050. So it's in that context that we're holding that discussion today as well. I'm hoping for a discussion that has some degree of geek, in the sense that what we want to discuss here today and in the 2 workshops to come is really the specifics of how this Renovation Wave initiative can look, and what are the drivers that will pull us forward in this environment that is changing by the day and requires us to adapt with it. And with that, I'd like to hand over the floor to Adrian for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Julie, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many of you online and that you have taken an interest in what EuroACE has got to say on this question in our mini series of workshops. I join Julie in her sentiments around the difficult times we're in, but the need to be conscious that afterwards we're going to have very coherent and strong strategies in place for all our sakes. So as the audience is very diverse, I will quickly present EuroACE. We are a Brussels-based trade association with 12 member companies coming from the building products, equipment, services sector. And together those companies employ more than 200,000 persons directly at more than 900 production facilities and office locations in the EU. And our work is to strive to improve the energy efficiency of buildings and therefore reduce their absolute energy demand in the most cost-effective way. And we believe that's the right thing to do because it creates employment and secures economic growth. It provides Europeans with comfortable and healthy homes and workplaces. It helps us to meet our carbon reduction targets and helps achieve energy security. So we work at EU policy level on EU directives and EU policy frameworks. One of our key actions that's pertinent for today is the Renovate Europe campaign, which is a political communications campaign now with 38 partners, all calling together to reduce the energy demand of the EU building stock by 80% by 2050 as compared to 2005. And I'm happy to say we are some way along that path, at least in terms of having a legislative framework in place. And I'm happy to say that our campaign is very well supported now by 41 champions together for renovation that include 29 members of the European Parliament from 5 political groups and 13 countries, 8 former MEPs, 1 French national member of Parliament, and 3 cities, with negotiations ongoing with other cities to champion our cause. Likewise, I like to recall the current policy context. The European Commission launched the European Green Deal late last year, and it contains several elements which are now gradually being unveiled. And we just heard about the climate law from Julie. One of the key things in that law is it's seeking to establish revised governance powers for the European Commission, and it will be interesting to watch that as it goes through the co-decision process to see whether they achieve the objectives. The Green Deal also includes the concept of a renovation wave, and that's the topic of this morning's webinar. And part of that is an open platform in renovation, something which is only vaguely described. In the European Parliament, there are 2 reports that are currently underway, first of which is a report on maximising energy efficiency in the EU building stock. And we and many of you are already making inputs to that through Kieran Cuff, who is the Green rapporteur on that. But there's also a report being prepared on affordable and decent housing for all, which would address some of the parallel issues that we think about at EuroACE. And then at member state level, we are seeing the implementation of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. The deadline for the transposition was the 10th of March. And on that day, all final long-term renovation strategies were meant to be submitted to the European Commission. From what I've learned, on the day, very few were submitted, but by now, nearly 2/3 of all member states have submitted their strategies and analysis is getting underway. I recall too that the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive requires that each member state has minimum energy performance standards in place, but generally they refer to new build, and this is something I want to come back to shortly. And following the submission of the final NECPs, that's National Energy and Climate Plans, at the end of last year, we see that member states are now in the process or must get into the process of implementing those plans. And we place great hope that they will do so ambitiously, completely and coherently. So in that policy context, where these 3 major institutions have serious responsibilities, what is the role of buildings? Well, our view is that you cannot avoid addressing energy demand in buildings. And the reason is that across their lifetimes, buildings consume 50% of primary energy in the EU. In doing so, they emit 50% of all EU energy-related emissions and utilize 50% of all mined resources coming from the planet. Therefore, the sector has a very strong responsibility to assist in getting Europe on track to climate neutrality by 2050. And I like to recall too that the construction sector itself is a major economic sector, employing more than 15 million workers, contributing more than 9% of EU GDP, and that the construction sector creates the places we occupy for more than 90% of the day, every day, possibly at the moment more than 99% of the day, every day, depending on where you are across Europe. So in our view, the impact of the buildings must be reduced over time, and our focus is on flying the flag for energy efficiency and reducing energy demand. So it's one strong voice, we hope, in the three elements shown here. And we believe that the importance and influence of the construction sector must be maintained as we go forward. So in thinking about the renovation wave in the European Green Deal, we're asking the question this morning, should it be a segment-based approach or an area-based approach? So what do we mean by a segment-based approach? Well, the building stock across Europe is extremely diverse, and in its own communication, the European Commission has highlighted three segments: social housing, schools, and hospitals. Social housing, I would think, is not understood the same way in every part of Europe. So we are working with the Commission and internally to understand better what they mean by social housing. Do they really mean people who require housing? Does it mean housing for the less well-off? Does it mean those in energy poverty, for example? Because social housing, as I mentioned, doesn't exist in the same way across all of Europe, and in some countries doesn't exist at all. And then schools and hospitals, indeed, very important segments where we all spend a part of our lives, a big part of our lives in many cases. But these are public buildings, and we believe that maybe all public buildings ought to be addressed in a segment-based approach. But other segments we can think of are offices and commercial buildings. A moment ago I mentioned the public buildings, and here we could link to Article 5 of the Energy Efficiency Directive, which may be coming up for review. You have private rented homes, you have owner-occupied, both homes and small businesses, etc. So there are many ways of thinking about the segments, and we would propose that each country will have a segment that's more readily addressable than other segments within their stock. But on top of understanding the building typologies, there are also various ownership models across the EU. You have publicly owned property, privately owned property, collectively owned in cooperatives. A lot of us live in cooperatively owned multi-family apartment buildings, business owned, so property held for investment reasons, etc. And also there are different consumer segments to be taken into account. The motivations for us as consumers to renovate are varied, and we have a good understanding of what the motivations are across the different consumer segments. Could the person that just joined mute, please? Thank you. And the identification of the motivations are varied, and we already understand them pretty well through various EU research projects, and marrying motivations with the various in the building typology is something that will be required in order to launch a renovation wave across a segment of the stock. It's our view that programs must be tailored to address each segment in an appropriate manner. So taking account of the characteristics of the building, the characteristics of the motivations of the consumer for the undertaking renovation. So how do we see the steps in a segment-based approach? So we understand what has worked before and why, so we can bring those elements and those programs and those approaches to the surface. We can, as I've just pointed out, choose segments where the ownership model and consumer motivation overlap and then are therefore receptive to being urged to take ambitious energy renovation measures in their buildings. Then, and here we need to rely on the different governance levels across Europe, so EU level, national level, regional level, and local level. We must ensure that the right enabling measures are in place and that the consumers and the building owners have an easy way of finding the information, the support, and the technical advice that they need. But critically moving forward, to monitor and measure the impact of the renovation waves is going to be very important, because we must understand how well we're progressing towards the long-term goals that we have set for ourselves. And in order to maintain motivation, we believe that deploying continuous supporting communications around the need for energy renovation, around the benefits that come from it, and around the enabling measures that are in place to encourage renovation is really important. And we also believe that it's important to have someone along that chain who's accountable for success. And in the current framework, it is the member states at national level that are accountable for success. That's probably the right level, but they must be well connected to regional and local levels and upwards towards the EU level, so that we as a region can see whether or not we're going towards the achievement of our long-term 2050 goals. So just a quick slide on what the enabling measures we have in mind are. And these are not necessarily all of the enabling measures that will be required. But having coherent long-term renovation strategies at national level that are reflected at regional and city and local level is really important. So coherence across governance levels in a member state, essential. And as we analyse in the weeks and months ahead the submitted long-term renovation strategies, we hope to find whether or not this coherence exists. We also feel that there should be targets for energy demand reduction for each segment. Take an example in the Netherlands. From 2023, it will not be possible to let an office building that has an energy performance label worse than C. So only A, B, C buildings can be let from that date forward. That's a target. And that has led to a great stimulus for energy renovation of office buildings in the Netherlands. And that links to the third point, which is having binding minimum energy performance standards when renovating is crucially important. We are at the moment missing a huge chance to go deeper each time we renovate. And it is our view that having minimum energy performance standards for each and every renovation and across each segment would be of the building stock would be a very powerful tool. Having independent technical assistance at all stages, so from the very earliest planning stages to handover and maintenance stages of projects, is important. And finally, but by no means least, the financial instruments should be in place that are tailored for each consumer segment. And happily, over the last 6 years, with the United Nations Finance Initiative and the European Commission, a great deal of work has been undertaken around financing instruments for energy efficiency in the building stock. So having the enabling measures in place for each of the segments that were identified as appropriate in a country, you can then create a segment-based renovation wave. So turning briefly then 2 slides on the area-based approach, what do we mean? Well, an area-based approach would define a group of buildings closely located to each other, and we suggest it ought to be selected on the ratio of worst performing buildings, though you could choose other criteria. And when you've identified those areas by a natural boundary that might be a technical boundary or an administrative boundary or a cultural boundary, you make a plan to renovate all the buildings in the defined area at the same time. Here, as before, we need to ensure that the significant enabling measures are in place and available. And we would propose then that an area be tendered in one go, which means you're aggregating the demand for renovation into a large contract that becomes more attractive for many of the financing instruments and options that are available. The advantages we see in an area-based approach is you can more quickly achieve economies of scale. You can improve all parts of the area, not just the buildings. So while you are focused on the buildings, when the whole area is being upgraded, you will find that it makes sense to do the streets, the small parks, the lighting, the transport network, etc. We think that's a real positive. Another great advantage of an area-based approach is that as everybody is given the opportunity to have their building renovated, there's no feeling of discrimination about why did my neighbour get this grant and I didn't have an opportunity, which has already existed and emerged in some regions of Europe. We believe it could consolidate communities, building greater community spirit and action, and then from there springboards potentially to future actions, and gives us urban regeneration opportunities, creating a just transition in areas across Europe. So just thinking momentarily about the area-based approach, we would say that experience shows that trust is built close to home. We tend to believe those we know best, and local governance and local areas and cities are closer to their citizens. Across the EU, many cities and regions have regulatory powers, so they have the opportunity to bring in area-based approaches, and that opportunity could, in our view, now be mobilized. And early experience with area-based programs is positive, and the one I know best is Scotland, where this area-based approach has been in use for a number of years, principally to assist in eliminating energy poverty, which is a real plague in that country. So to round off my presentation, I come back to the question, segment or area-based approach? Well, as with the World Health Organization advice during the current crisis, our view is we need to use all measures now and ensure that they are effectively implemented. In other words, it's not either or, it's both and. We need to use both segment-based approaches and area-based approaches as we move forward. And as we get onto the path to recovery, we believe that rapid uptake of both of these approaches will be required if renovation waves are to be successful across Europe. And we will find that each country will have a slightly different approach, but in other words, we will see multiple energy renovation waves flowing across Europe in the months and years ahead. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I hand back to my colleague Helen, who will now moderate any questions that have been asked or that are going to be asked now through the chat box. So thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Adrian, for your presentation. Now we're turning towards the Q&A session till about 10 minutes after 10. So we have about 15 minutes. There are already some questions, but don't hesitate to type in your questions now, and I see they are coming in. Maybe starting the first questions from Oliver Rapp from BPIE, who is asking, Adrian, do you think it is sufficient to focus on the 3 buildings types suggested by the European Commission?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. My short answer to that is no. I think there are three important types, but my experience shows that social housing, where it exists, is already one of the most motivated sectors, where already quite a high ambition is reflected in ongoing works to social housing. Schools and hospitals definitely are a good two segments to address. We know that children are more prone to poor indoor air quality and poor indoor environments. So renovating schools to improve those not only improves their well-being, their learning capacity, but also their health. So I think that's really important. And hospitals, I think it goes without saying, the same factors apply. We know from work undertaken by your own institute that recovery rates and number of days in hospital beds is significantly reduced when buildings, hospitals are well energy renovated. So these are understandable segments for the Commission to have pointed out, but we feel strongly that addressing worst performing buildings and lifting people out of energy poverty is a bit overlooked. And we believe that all public buildings ought to be given a target for energy renovation, as the public sector, with our money and our interests at heart, ought to be leading the way and showing that this is possible. So I hope that answers your question, Oliver.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. Staying on the different approaches for a renovation wave, there is a question from Sabine Poquet from Velux, Belgium, and she is talking about area-based approaches, saying it is complicated because for the moment you cannot oblige people to renovate. So I guess it can work if it is supported by general obligations to renovate. So maybe you have an answer to the link between area-based approach and obligations.
Yes, Sabine, that's an interesting question. And it's why in the presentation I tried to hint that it's going to be those cities and regions that have regulatory powers that can take the area-based approach more effectively. And this is the case in Scotland, where through devolution they have the energy dossier in their powers, and they have put into place a regulatory framework. What I understand of the regulatory framework is that within an area, the obligation is to upgrade your building within 10 years. And that if you do it within the 10 years, the enabling measures and the support packages are available. But outside the 10 years, you're penalized and you're through taxation measures, if I recall correctly. So that is a kind of a stick and carrot approach, that if you do the work in the area within the program period, you're fully supported, you get preferential loans, etc. And outside that period, you have penalties. This means that you're giving people a choice, but the choice is so stark that most people will choose to do the works to their building during the program period. In Scotland, it's 10 years. So yes, it is complicated. Yes, it takes time to put the regulations in place, but once it's done, area by area approach can really get those economies of scale and those large scale developments going, I think more quickly than when we go segment by segment. I hope that answers at least in part your question, Sabine.
Thank you, Adrian. Another question coming in, interestingly, asked the question about linking the two approaches. It's a question from Julia Barbano asking, so the idea is that segment-based approaches are the operational way to implement area-based approach?
Julia, that's an interesting thought. Indeed, one of the things we feel is that the area-based approach should not take away from the need to address building level energy performance. And so, indeed, in a coherent area-based approach, you would be potentially linking up the two. However, that's not necessarily the case, and I'm just thinking about how, as a contractor, you would go about an area-based approach. I'm not sure you would go in and do all the houses first, and then do all the offices in the area, and then do all the public buildings in the area. You would, of course, have some kind of structured plan for that, and you might decide to go street by street, so that you're not going back to the streets to disrupt on 2 or 3 occasions because you've taken a segment by segment approach within the area. So indeed, careful planning, careful programming and scheduling of the works is needed. And but what I take from your question is that indeed, within an area-based approach, all the segments or building types within the area will be addressed and renovated during the program period. So in that sense, it marries the two together. I hope that answers your question.
On to the next question now, which is looking at the segment approach and focusing on a particular segment. The question is from Asen Charliski, asking, multifamily and housing cooperatives offer the biggest opportunity, yet it is the most challenging sector. Do you think the EU should insist or request each country to prioritize the segment where the impact will be most significant?
Yeah, there's no question that multifamily homes, buildings that are often 6, 8 stories high or sometimes 20 or 30 stories high, are a big challenge. And we haven't discussed whether we believe the EU ought to choose that segment as one for an obligatory requirement. But we know that a member state can choose those segments to be the subject of an obligation. And within the framework that we've seen the EU operate in up to this stage, it is for the member state to decide. Now, what I do agree with is that multifamily homes of that nature are difficult, and that links to the ownership model and quite often to the management of the building. Because inside those buildings, the rules are strict about who pays for the work and how many of the owner occupiers or residents have to agree to the works. So it is a complicated area, but it is an area of large opportunity. And as such, I think the member states ought to be looking more favorably at multifamily homes as a segment to be addressed. And I would say particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, where the typologies of those buildings, so the technical specifications and the method of construction is, let's not call it the same, but it's quite similar. And as I understand it, there are certain approaches that were really multiplied, like photocopied across many countries. So it should be a segment that could easily be upscaled. And when I think about multifamily homes, I can't help thinking about the extremely good work that was done, although not in the Central and Eastern European region, but in France, in Bordeaux, in a project called Le Parc, where in a multifamily home, a large precast concrete new element was attached to the south side of the building, while the north, east and west were well insulated with new lifts put into place. And in that project, the tenants in the building, because it's social housing, all achieved a 60% reduction in their energy demand, had an increase of 50% in their floor space, and their rent was hardly impacted. The cost of living in the building was hardly impacted, but the amenity of living in the building was greatly improved. And I like that example because it shows that, and it's a model that could be, in my view, replicated across many parts of Europe. It's on the Renovate Europe website from our exhibition from 2019, for those that would like to look at it. It could be replicated, I believe, right across the Central and Eastern European area, and its cost was very reasonable. In the French context, it was reported to cost 415 euros per square meter, which is within the realms of affordable within the research that we read. So yeah, I have a lot of time for multifamily homes, and thank you for the question, Asian.
Now on to questions not on the approach, but maybe linking the long-term renovation strategies and the renovation wave. There are several questions asking whether the long-term renovation strategies are fit for purpose, and especially are they fit for purpose if they don't follow a segment or an area-based approach?
Well, the deadline, as most people in the webinar will know, for submitting the final long-term renovation strategies was just the 10th of March, just 2 weeks ago. And I have not seen or analysed any of those long-term renovation strategies. So answering the question, are they fit for purpose, is not something I can do today. As I said in my presentation, we know that the Commission is analysing those, and we're trying to keep close to the Commission to get early indications of whether they're fit for purpose. What I can say is that the way the building directive set out the requirements that should be in a long-term renovation strategy mean that if they are properly included and properly planned, and all of those elements are in the strategies, they should be fit for purpose. And so time will tell. And within the LTRS, I think we hope to see that several countries have highlighted a segment, either a worst performing segment or a segment that where the consumer or the owner profile is conducive to being addressed early, or maybe even, and they're required to do that, have a plan for their public buildings as a segment. So yes, and I know that the Commission are going to be analysing the long-term renovation strategies in the expectation that they will find elements that can be then the foundational elements for the renovation wave communication at the end of September. So a lot of hope is being pinned on the quality and content of the LTRS, but I'm afraid it's too early, in my view, to say whether these are fit for purpose or whether they're going to be the stimulus needed to get those renovation waves going that we really hope and need to plan for towards the end of the year. So they're my thoughts on that topic, Helen.
Thank you. Then we have questions which are looking at maybe a bit broader topics. One question from Andras Stott from DG Klima, asking if there is any need for renovation standards to ensure renovated buildings are resilient to future climate impact. That was also a question asked by Spiridon. And Frank Klinkenberg, also related question, asking, when looking at long-term renovation strategies, shouldn't we also look at clean energy supply?
Yeah, these are good questions. As I hinted during my presentation, of course, EuroACE is speaking for the energy efficiency and the energy demand reduction part of the spectrum. But we are not blind to the need for resilience against climate impacts that are just increasing day by day. And we do support the provision in the Buildings Directive that allows for member states to include other requirements together with energy renovation requirements. So seismic stability is mentioned, removal of hazardous materials, I believe, is mentioned, at least in the recitals. So linking up across different building sector related issues is a good idea, so that when we may address a building comprehensively, we make it resilient for the future, not just from an energy perspective, but from a climate impact perspective, from an accessibility perspective, from a health perspective. And we make sure that our stock is future-proofed. I think that could be the word that would join the three questions together, Helen. So as I say, EuroACE stands for the energy efficiency and energy reduction part, but we are not blind to the fact that whole sustainability of the building sector is coming at us fast, and that we are looking at it within our internal debates. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrian. Maybe the last question before we wrap up. There were several questions on, is the renovation sector ready to step up for this renovation wave? And more specifically, are our members, for example, preparing for this renovation wave by increasing the number of trainings and skills?
I'm happy to say the answer to that is yes, because there's a strong realization and understanding among our members that when the renovation wave comes, the demand for their products and services will increase, and that when that happens, there must be an adequate workforce and well-trained workforce out there so that all of the products are put together in the right way and in a way that they deliver the promise of the performance that they say they will achieve. And we know very well that in energy renovation work, it's really very important that each trade person understands their place in the chain and how their work is impacted by the work of previous trades on the site and how their work will impact the future trades on the site. And indeed, many of our member companies are opening dedicated training centres where they are running training courses for their products, but not just their products in conjunction with elements of construction like a whole roof or a whole wall or a whole heating system. So they are very aware of this responsibility and are looking to do it. And we, within EuroACE, are opening conversations about how to ensure we have the number of labourers and workers in the segment and that each of them has the right level of knowledge and training. But not only workers, we also know that upstream, the designers and the engineers and the cost consultants need to understand their role, and downstream, the facility managers and those who maintain the building over time know their role. So yeah, we're very conscious of it. I know our members are very responsible on this point, and we expect to be ready for the renovation wave when it comes. Voila.
So now, yes, it's almost 10:15 and the end of our webinar. Thank you, Adrian, for responding to the questions, and especially thanks for all of you who have asked so many questions. I see that there was also even a good discussion between participants in the chat box, so that's great. For those questions that we did not address during this session, we will make sure to come back to you in writing. And now I pass the floor to Julie Krestrup for the final words of conclusion.
Yes, hello. Thanks, everyone. So I've got 2 minutes left, and in that I also need to advertise the 2 upcoming webinars, so I'll keep it very short. So I think the first conclusion is to say that there is clearly a lot of interest in this topic. We've hovered around the late 70s in terms of participants throughout the course. So not only did you join, you also stayed. So I take that to mean that you thought we had an interesting discussion. I think the other key conclusion here, and it was in the slides, but also in discussion, is that there is a lot of potential, but there is also no one size fits all. So there is potential across sectors, across areas, but there are also still some pretty elementary issues we need to solve around sort of regrouping projects, about funding, so on and so forth. Then I think the other thing that I'm taking from me today, we focused on the renovation wave, but there are a lot of adjacent issues to discuss. There was the issue around sort of sustainability and resilience that was brought up by a number of people. There were also a couple of questions we didn't get to touch on about how do we tag on the building sector sort of to a much broader discussion about energy systems. Can we isolate renovation basically from looking at the overall energy system? And those are topics that we've also started thinking about as EuroACE, and we'll come back to. Then I think a key point for me is also the need to incorporate all the good learnings that are already out there. And again, some of you shared in the comments examples of things that have worked or things that have not worked. In Adrian's slide, I think one of the calls really was to look at the good example of what's working out there in Europe already. We're working to capture that as EuroACE, but we're of course very, very interested in any further input you have on that. And finally, I think a point to us as a company and with the other members is this notion to step up in the renovation wave. As Adrian is saying, we are doing a lot as individual companies, but I think we also need to talk more about what we're doing in terms of actually prepping the installer base, the construction sector out there to be ready for that renovation wave. So I think that's a to-do for the corporate members to really think about how we can be more vocal about what's being done, what's still needed, and how we communicate about that. And then, as I already sort of teased you with, we have 2 more seminars coming up, and I think we've got a slide. There you go. So one is taking place on the 31st of March. So that's at some point next week. Like everyone else, I've completely lost traction of what day that might be. But it's on financing for energy efficient buildings and renovation. It's going to be the same format, so 45 minutes like today, with 1 presentation and then a discussion. And then on the 2nd of April, I think, the 3rd of April, I see here, we will be discussing the ecosystem of the renovation and talk about what are the things I brought up in the comment here, which is what are the other sort of pieces of upcoming legislation, regulation, and guidance that will affect the overall sort of ecosystem of renovation of the energy transition. And of course, we hope to see you there. I'm just going to string this on my colleagues because I haven't told them this, but I think we'll do a little survey following this webinar just to hear what, from your perspective, went well, if there are any things to improve on, and also topics you'd like us to see tackle at a later stage. And with that, thank you very much from our end. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully see you online again next week for the next workshop.